The story of Galileo. The most eminent men of science and philosophy of the day did not escape the watchful eye of this cruel despotism. Galileo, the chief astronomer and mathematician of his age, was the first to use the telescope successfully in solving the movements of the heavenly bodies. He discovered that the sun is the center of motion around which the earth and various planets revolve. For making this great discovery, Galileo was brought before the Inquisition and for a while was in great danger of being put to death. After a long and bitter review of Galileo's writings, in which many of his most important discoveries were condemned as errors, the charge of the Inquisitors went on to declare, quote, that you, Galileo, have upon account of those things which you have written and confessed, subjected yourself to a strong suspicion of heresy in this holy office by believing and holding to be true a doctrine which is false and contrary to the sacred and divine scripture, that the sun is the center of the orb of the earth and does not move from the east to the west, and that the earth moves and is not the center of the world. End quote. In order to save his life, Galileo admitted that he was wrong in thinking that the earth revolved around the sun and swore that, quote, for the future I will never say more or assert, either by word or writing, anything that shall give occasion for a like suspicion. End quote. But immediately after taking this forced oath, he is said to have whispered to a friend standing near, quote, the earth moves for all that. End quote. Summary of the Inquisition. Of the multitudes who perished by the Inquisition throughout the world, no authentic record is now discoverable. But wherever popery had power, there was the tribunal. It had been planted even in the East, and the Portuguese Inquisition of Goa was, until within these few years, fed with many an agony. South America was partitioned into provinces of the Inquisition, and with the ghastly mimicry of the crimes of the mother state, the arrivals of viceroys and the other popular celebrations were thought imperfect without an auto de fe. The Netherlands were one scene of slaughter from one time of the decree which planted the Inquisition among them. In Spain, the calculation is more attainable. Each of the 17 tribunals during a long period burned annually, on an average, 10 miserable beings. We are to recollect that this number was in a country where persecution had for ages abolished all religious differences, and where the difficulty was not to find the stake, but the offering. Yet even in Spain, thus gleaned of all heresy, the Inquisition could still swell its list of murders into 32,000. The numbers burned in effigy, or condemned to penance, punishments generally equivalent to exile, confiscation, and taints of blood, to all ruin but the mere loss of worthless life, amounted to 309,000. But the crowds who perished in dungeons of torture, of confinement, and of broken hearts, the millions of dependent lives made utterly helpless, or hurried to the grave by the death of the victims, are beyond all register, or recorded only before him who has sworn that, quote, he that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. End quote. Such was the Inquisition, declared by the Spirit of God to be at once the offspring and the image of the popedom. To feel the force of the parentage, we must look to the time. In the 13th century, the popedom was at the summit of mortal dominion. It was independent of all kingdoms. It ruled with a rank of influence never before or since possessed by a human scepter. It was the knowledge sovereign of body and soul. To all earthly intents, its power was immeasurable for good or evil. It might have spread literature, peace, freedom, and Christianity to the ends of Europe or the world, but its nature was hostile. Its fuller triumph only disclosed its fuller evil, and to the shame of human reason and the terror and the suffering of human virtue, Rome, in the hour of its consummate grandeur, teemed with the monstrous and horrid birth of the Inquisition. An account of the persecutions in Italy under the papacy. We shall now enter on account of the persecutions in Italy, a country which has been and still is the center of popery, the seat of the pontiff, and the source of the various errors which have spread themselves over other countries, deluded the minds of thousands, and diffused the clouds of superstition and bigotry over the human understanding. In pursuing our narrative, we shall include the most remarkable persecutions which have happened, and the cruelties which have been practiced. by the immediate power of the Pope, through the power of the Inquisition, at the instigation of particular orders of the clergy, and by the bigotry of the Italian princes. In the 12th century, the first persecutions under the papacy began in Italy, at the time that Adrian, an Englishman, was pope, being occasioned by the following circumstances. A learned man and an excellent orator of Brescia named Arnold came to Rome, and boldly preached against the corruptions and innovations which had crept into the church. His discourses were so clear, consistent, and breathed forth such a pure spirit of piety that the senators and many of the people highly approved of and admired his doctrines. This so greatly enraged Adrian that he commanded Arnold instantly to leave the city as a heretic. Arnold, however, did not comply, for the senators and some of the principal people took his part and resisted the authority of the Pope. Adrian now laid the city of Rome under an interdict, which caused the whole body of clergy to interpose, and at length he persuaded the senators and people to give up the point and suffer Arnold to be banished. This being agreed to, he received the sentence of exile and retired to Germany, where he continued to preach against the Pope and to expose the gross errors of the Church of Rome. Adrian on this account thirsted for his blood and made several attempts to get him into his hands, but Arnold for a long time avoided every snare laid for him. At length, Frederick Barbarossa, arriving at the imperial dignity, requested that the Pope would crown him with his own hand. This Adrian complied with, and at the same time asked a favor of the emperor, which was to put Arnold into his hands. The emperor very readily delivered up the unfortunate preacher, who soon fell a martyr to Adrian's vengeance, being hanged and his body burnt to ashes at Apulia. The same fate attended several of his old friends and companions. Inquisition, a Spaniard, was sent to Rome to be brought up in the Roman Catholic faith, but having conversed with some of the Reformed and having read several treatises which they put into his hands, he became a Protestant. This at length being known, one of his own relations informed against him when he was burnt by order of the Pope in a conclave of cardinals. The brother of Inquisition had been taken up much about the same time for having a New Testament in the Spanish language in his possession, but before the time appointed for his execution, he found means to escape out of prison and retired to Germany. Fanianus, a learned layman, by reading controversial books became of the Reformed religion. On information being exhibited against him to the Pope, he was apprehended and cast into prison. His wife, children, relations, and friends visited him in his confinement, and so far wrought upon his mind that he renounced his faith and obtained his release. But he was no sooner free from confinement than his mind felt the heaviest of chains, the weight of a guilty conscience. His horrors were so great that he found them insupportable until he had returned from his apostasy and declared himself fully convinced of the errors of the Church of Rome. To make amends for his falling off, he now openly and strenuously did all he could to make converts to Protestantism, and was successful in his endeavors. These proceedings occasioned his second imprisonment, but he had his life offered him if he would recant again. This proposal he rejected with disdain, saying that he scorned life upon such terms. Being asked why he would obstinately persist in his opinions and leave his wife and children in distress, he replied, quote, "I shall not leave them in distress. I have recommended them to the care of an excellent trustee." End quote. "What trustee?" said the person who had asked the question with some surprise. To which Fanianus answered, quote, "Jesus Christ is the trustee I mean, and I think I could not commit them to a care of a better." End quote. On the day of execution, he appeared remarkably cheerful, which one observing said, quote, "It is strange you should appear so merry upon such an occasion, when Jesus Christ himself, just before his death, was in such agonies that he sweated blood and water." End quote. To which Fanianus replied, quote, "Christ sustained all manner of pains and conflicts with hell and death on our accounts, and thus, by his sufferings, freed those who really believe in him from the fear of them." End quote. He was then strangled, his body was burnt to ashes, and then scattered about by the wind. Dominicus, a learned soldier, having read several controversial writings, became a zealous Protestant, and retiring to Placentia, he preached the gospel in its utmost purity to a very considerable congregation. One day, at the conclusion of his sermon, he said, quote, "If the congregation will attend tomorrow, I will give them a description of Antichrist and paint him out in his proper colors." End quote. A vast concourse of people attended the next day. But just as Dominicus was beginning his sermon, a civil magistrate went up to the pulpit and took him into custody. He readily submitted, but as he went along with the magistrate, he made use of this expression, quote, "I wonder the devil hath let me alone so long." End quote. When he was brought to examination, this question was put to him, quote, "Will you renounce your doctrines?" End quote. To which he replied, "My doctrines? I maintain no doctrines of my own. What I preach are the doctrines of Christ, and for those I will forfeit my blood, and even think myself happy to suffer for the sake of my Redeemer." Every method was taken to make him recant for his faith and embrace the errors of the Church of Rome. But when persuasions and menaces were found ineffectual, he was sentenced to death and hanged in the marketplace. Gelasius, a Protestant gentleman who resided near the castle of St. Angelo, was apprehended on account of his faith. Great endeavors being used by his friends, he recanted and subscribed to several of the superstitious doctrines propagated by the Church of Rome. Becoming, however, sensible of his error, he publicly renounced his recantation. Being apprehended for this, he was condemned to be burnt, and agreeable to the order was chained to a stake, where he was left several hours before the fire was put to the faggots, in order that his wife, relations, and friends who surrounded him might induce him to give up his opinions. Gelasius, however, retained his constancy of mind and entreated the executioner to put fire to the wood that was to burn him. This at length he did, and Gelasius was soon consumed in the flames, which burnt with amazing rapidity and deprived him of sensation in a few minutes. Soon after this gentleman's death, a great number of Protestants were put to death in various parts of Italy on account of their faith, giving a sure proof of their sincerity in their martyrdoms.